Hello and welcome to the first podcast in our first full unit. Congratulations on surviving that terribly exciting math review unit. So now we get to move on to some bigger and better things and actually begin to talk a little bit on the edges of chemistry. So we're going to start by classifying changes and properties. So first off, what's the difference between a property versus a change? When you see property, we're going to be talking about things that can be measured. On the other hand, when you see change, that's going to be describing things that, quote, happen to a substance. We don't say temperature happens to a substance or weight happens to a substance, because those are things that we measure about a substance and we'll consider those properties. On the other hand, we do say boiling is something that can happen to a substance, or rusting is something that can happen to a substance. So those are changes. After we've decided whether something is property or a change, we're going to add the adjective physical or chemical. And that's to denote changes that don't change what the substance is, in the case of physical, or do change what the substance is, in the case of chemical. Now, our physical changes, or properties, they may alter the way the substance looks, such as tearing up a piece of paper, but it doesn't change what the substance actually is. It's still paper in that case. Chemical changes, on the other hand, do change what the substance is. For instance, if we rust a piece of iron, that pile of rust is now no longer chemically the same thing, so that is a chemical change. So to help you correctly identify things, I've got this flowchart that you can look at, and it's going to divide things into chemical change, physical change, versus chemical property, physical property. And the first question that you need to ask yourself is it something that I measure? If it is something that you measure, that's going to steer you over to the property side of things. If it's not something that you measure, in other words, it's just something that happens to the substance, that's going to send you over to the change side. Now, whichever side you end up on, you're going to notice that the next question is pretty similar in both cases. And that's so that you can tell the difference between the chemical versus the physical. And that is going to be asking, does this change what the substance is? If it does change what the substance is, it's boiling. If it doesn't, it's physical. And the same thing for the property side. If the act of measuring it changes what it is, chemical. If it doesn't, physical. So let's run through some examples here. And a very common example that I might use is boiling. Now, I would say boiling is not something that I measure, so I'm going to come over here. It's just a change that happens to a substance. Now I consider when I boil water, for instance, does that change what the substance is? When I boil water and it turns into steam, it certainly looks different, but the molecules in that steam are still H2O, so I've not really changed what the substance is, only the way that it looks. So that is going to put boiling, it's really sloppy, but that's boiling, under the physical change. And another thing that you're going to notice, for every change that I can have a property linked with it. And in that case, for boiling, that's going to be boiling point. And we would get over here because boiling point is something specifically that I measure about a substance. I set the water on to boil and put a thermometer in it, take the measurement of the temperature when it begins to boil. So that is a measurement. And I ask myself, does measuring the boiling point change what the substance is? We already established that boiling doesn't, so measuring the boiling point isn't going to change what the substance is either. So it's a physical property. And I could repeat this with some other similar changes of state. So I could have melting and melting point. You could do freezing and freezing point, evaporation, evaporation rate. Any change of state is going to be a physical change, and there'll be a corresponding property with it. And you have to just pay close attention to how I've worded it so that you can tell the difference between things that I'm wanting you to label as changes versus things that I'm wanting you to label as properties. Let's look at some chemical examples. Let's take burning, for instance. Burning is not something that I measure. It's a change that happens to a substance, so I'm going to say no. When I burn something, does it change what it is? Well, that pile of ashes left over after I burn it is certainly not the same as what I started with. So I'm going to say burning